Yeah, so open
Okay,
to guys listen.
we have to start, colleagues, and I'm sorry. I was just waiting for you to round up what you were sharing with Ngodup. Colleague, apologies. I can't turn on my camera because my setting is me. It's not okay. I'm trying to figure out what I did with my laptop. Notwithstanding, this afternoon, welcome again for taking time for this webinar. Adam, please, you will have to send me your PowerPoint. If Magdalene also is presenting on PowerPoint, you can send to my email so I can share when it's time for you to speak.
Okay.
So
That's going to be a bit difficult now, Acha, for me to send the PowerPoint. Sorry.
no. But did you prepare it?
Yeah, I did, but it's just that I'm working off 2 laptops and I've got it in my hard drive.
Okay, that's
So,
fine. That's fine. I will see how we can. But can you speak without a PowerPoint display?
yes.
All right, because I will have shared it. And I assist in as you talk. So today's webinar, colleagues, we're talking about Tibet and the United Nations International Day of Torture, which is actually today. It's an International Day commemoration. And for this webinar today, we have 3 speakers. We have Mr. Adam Salmon. Adam works as parliament advisor on Home Affairs, and he has been a year-long Free Tibet advocate. We have Ms. Magdalene Moonsamy. She's an admitted attorney at the High Court of South Africa. And of course, we have my dear friend, Mr. Ngodup Dorjee, who is the former representative of the Office of Tibet in South Africa. Without further ado, I would like to call the current representative of the Office of Tibet, Mr. Jam Langla, to give us a 5-minute opening remarks. Then we will welcome our speakers. I'm not going to make so much comment before our speakers speak, for the simple reason that in the university, sometimes when you talk before speakers speak, they then accuse you that what they have prepared, you've already said it. So I will refrain from talking and can only make comments when it's time for Q&A. Jamian, please give us an opening remark.
Okay, thank you. Dear Dharma brothers and sisters, Tashidele, I extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you to our webinar today. It is a pleasure to have our esteemed moderator, speakers, and attendees gathered here on this significant day. The United Nations International Day in support of victims of torture. Today, we gather to acknowledge the suffering endured by countless individuals worldwide and to reaffirm our collective commitment to ending torture in all its forms. As we turn our attention to the plight of Tibetan people, we are reminded of the grave human rights abuse Tibetan people have faced for many decades. The Tibetan community has been subjected to severe repression, arbitrary detention, inhuman treatment, with many enduring unimaginable torture for expressing our cultural and religious identity. The International Day in support of victims of torture is not only a day of remembrance, but also a day of action. It compels us to amplify the voice of who has been silenced and to support survival in their journey towards healing and justice. The resilience of Tibetan people in the face of such adversity to testament is a testament to unbreakable human spirit. Today, let us stand in solidarity with victims and survival of torture in Tibet and all around the world. Let us renew our dedication to the principle of human dignity and human rights. Together, we can work towards a future where torture is eradicated and every individual can live free from fear and oppression. So before we proceed, I want to express my gratitude to our moderator, Dr. Atta, for organizing amazing webinar again. And also I want to express my gratitude to our speakers for their willingness to share their expertise with us. Your insights are invaluable in deepening understanding of this significant day. To our attendees, thank you for joining us. Your presence enrich our discussion and contribute the richness of learning, collective learning experience. Without further ado, let us begin our explore the United Nations International Day. I'm pleased to hand over the virtual stage to our moderator, Dr. Atta, to kick off the conversation. Welcome, Dr. Atta. We are very excited to have you lead this conversation and share your insight with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamyang La. I must say that you're doing so well at the Office of Tibet. You've maintained Tibet network in South Africa, and you are working hard to increase it. We must all applaud you for that. Without further ado, colleagues, allow me to invite Ms. Magdalene Moonsamy, who is our first speaker for today. She's going to speak to us for 10 minutes. She will reflect, among many other things, on the history of the United Nations International Day of Torture and the significance thereof. Maggie, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, and to all esteemed guests and to those who have joined in. It is quite a time that we are in, not just in our space in South Africa, but in the world, where we are facing the historical, what I would believe to be the benevolent great power of China as being an oxymoron. I think what is significant for me is that in my reflections over the developments since 1984, the adoption by the General Assembly of the Convention Against Torture and Other Degrading Treatments, and then coming into force in 1987, it became clear that there was still a resolution passed in 1997, Resolution 52 of 149, proclaiming this day to be June 26th, being the UN International Day in support of victims of torture. I think what for me has become significant in the current global dynamic is the fact that we have China, which continues to play an aggressive yet assertive role. And if we have to go back historically and ask the question why the expansionist nature of China did not go as far as Australia or outside, one would realize that it may have experienced weaknesses, that it could not and yet abuse those weaknesses on the people of Tibet. For me, the biggest paradox that I would like to present on today is the special rapporteur well, this was in 95, who went out to look at detention centers and prisons. And the report that was then provided was to say, let us make sure that there are health practitioners who are going to ensure that these detainees or political prisoners are going to be provided with treatment. Now, that by its very nature is an insult to injury. It's adding insult to injury in the sense that you are sending out a special rapporteur with a team to give medical support to people who are and may be illegally detained and imprisoned. But it goes on in terms of the preventative measures. So the United Nations, in my view, in as much as we can all want to assume, I wrote a paper on the lack of common sense of the United Nations as an international instrument, and one where when we have to reflect on the various protocols, conventions, etc., nothing can be told about releasing, 1, restraint, 2, and 3, non-aggression. So what we are treating are the symptoms and not the cause. And that, for me, I think in my presentation is most fundamental. How do we identify a political detainee or a political prisoner? And I want us to understand that a political prisoner is not a criminal. They're acting in accordance with the rights of self-determination in some instances. They are acting in the right of protecting the interests of what they believe to be their interests and their freedoms. And when we don't unpack the aspect of what do these freedoms mean and at what cost do they come, we then find situations where torture, as degrading as it is acknowledged. It's acknowledged by the United Nations. Degrading treatment, torture, inhumane punishment, etc. So the contradiction that I face is being for us to be able to say, okay, fine, we've got these special rapporteurs, we've got national preventative mechanisms, we've got resolution upon resolution upon resolution. But those resolutions are not saying, one of the intentions is to eradicate, but the total eradication. But the total eradication doesn't take away the principle of holding accountable the perpetrator. And I think that that is where we need to be moving in that direction. How do we hold the perpetrator accountable? Because even the 2002 optional protocol to the convention was forcing its hands to say, oh, we're giving people who are illegally detained medical care, failing the fact that they have maybe had amputations, etc. And we know this from our experience at how when we attended the gathering in the Dharamshala, that there were people who lose their, being abused with electronic batons, losing their feet, losing parts of their bodies, trying to cross over. But the reality is the treatment doesn't cure the problem. And for me, in my view and respectful self, believe that the issue of accountability and good governance, what the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights has been in attempting to do since its inception, as is other institutions or the International Criminal Court of Justice, etc. The reality is that there's no accountability. The accountability comes after there has been an eradication of a population. And this is where we go back into the history books and understand what was China's need for expansion in its region, but not outside. Simply because it then needed to be this assertive, this aggressive, and what I earlier deemed, or what was earlier in quotations, seen as a benevolent great power. And hence, the issue then has to be, in terms of the accountability aspect, how do we create that platform where accountability has to come to a point of whether we understand this in terms of war and peace. Is this torture an act of war? And we need to answer that question. And if it is an act of war, what are the repercussions of such? Because we've seen this and we know what is happening in Palestine, in Pakistan, in Kashmir, in Western Sahara, in Syria, etc. If torture is then not attached to what then becomes the definition of an act of war in respect of what the United Nations imposes on, including that of NATO, then why is there no intervention? So who do we then hold accountable in terms of lack of intervention in a space where the correlation between torture and war are inseparable? So for me, I think that despite these protocols, despite our writings, despite what we're doing, what is the action in terms of qualifying that the situation that we are faced with, and one in particular in relation to Tibet, can there be a political will? Because the legality is clear. The legal aspects, the protocols are there, but the protocols are manipulated in its language in the extent that it does not say, let us hold accountable who was responsible for the medical conditions of the detainees and prisoners, or women and children, for that matter, the general population that is showing no resistance physically, but is being then under the condition of being violated. So I think that's the first thing, is to understand whether this is an act of occupation or an act of war. An act of occupation means that there can be negotiation, there can be referendum, there can be different forms and means of how do we then resolve or come to some kind of a conclusion. But an act of war is deliberate, closing down of schools, forcing culture to be suppressed, forcing the right to self-determination to be oppressed. And I think that that is the critical thing that we need to first get to, because we can go through all the conventions and still know the role of NATO in agitating war globally. And hence, mine is that, yes, there are the protocols. There is the call for total eradication. How far have we gone? Are we now in a perpetual space where it has intensified? And indeed it has. Look, we don't need to go into the current day circumstances. But what the world is determining in terms of the right to self-determination, which is one of the pillars of the United Nations Declaration, is being defecated on. And hence, we need to then start to analyze from that point, where do we go to from here? How do we consolidate in questioning and answering and being honest about, does torture qualify, does occupation qualify torture? Or is it just war that qualifies torture in a clandestine manner? And for me, it is quite clear that before we can even look at the aspects of torture and the experiences, and we've got lists and eons of experiences of now diminished population. And that's my next point. In terms of the conventions, conventions are saying...
One, Maggie, please.
Sorry?
Could you wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Okay, no problem. Oh, my thought was, yes, the diminishing of population. Are acts of torture, detention, and imprisonment, and killings a diminishing of a population in order to have its right to self-determination and not exercise its voice? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Magdalene. There are a lot of things that you have touched on, especially one thing that is sensitive to a lot of us. You mentioned about the expansion of time now, which I believe is the base, of the Tibetan Malays. Let me call our second speaker, Mr. Adam Salmon, to give us his presentation.
Hi, can I confirm that you can see the presentation?
Yes, please, we can.
Thank you. I'm just going to look at some of the situation around torture and human rights in South Africa and how it relates to the need for advocacy locally and also abroad, just to tie it into Ngodupla's talk and also to kind of give some local context to what Magdalene's speaking to. So forgive the South Africans amongst the audience, but just briefly a history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which was established in 1996 after the end of the apartheid regime in 1994. And it was designed as a means to kind of disclose the full extent of the torture, murder, rape, and other sinister disappearances of citizens that happened in the country, largely by the country's armed forces. And there were human rights violations committees that were established basically to assess the extent of the perpetration, as well as the ability for those who perpetrated to have to get amnesty. And there was a series of reparation policies, and these were in turn done in a significant report, which reported something along the rounds of 22,000 statements, violating all kinds of torture, killing, and disappearance and abductions and severe ill treatment. The post-TRC, post this significant report, the TRC voices regret that there was very little overlap between what the victims were reporting as versus those who were seeking amnesty. So there wasn't as much of a meeting between the victims and the perpetrators as was envisaged. Secondly, it was in 1998, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation surveyed several hundred victims of human rights abuses during apartheid and found that most felt that the TRC had failed to achieve the reconciliation between the Black and white communities. And most believe that justice was a prerequisite for reconciliation rather than an alternative to it. So it's still feeling the need for prosecution for those crimes. And indeed, that the process itself was weighed in favor of the perpetrators of the abuse, which we'll see as a theme emerging later. As a result of the TRC's shortcomings, there were a series of cases brought about by NGOs and victims, both in South Africa and in international courts in the 2000s. So there was some follow-up of those reports. Post-apartheid torture continues in various forms, particularly in places of detention, as Magdalene was mentioning, and also in particular related to African migrants. This has highlighted a continued culture of violence and xenophobia in the country, and contrasts the human rights orientation of our international policies versus the reality of a continued internationally very high rate of violent crime and the difficulty for the armed forces or the state structures to deal with that violence. The Prevention of Combating of Tortured Persons Act was enacted in 2013 and to ratify our signing of the International Convention on Torture, as well as in 2019 the optional protocol mentioned by Magdalene as well, relating to particular cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. And this led to the establishment of a national preventative mechanism comprised of authorities that are already in place here, namely the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, as well as the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services and the Human Rights Commission, who is in fact responsible for making an annual report to the UN on what has been done in torture. The reports by all these organizations, as well as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, amongst others, has continued to highlight the systematic nature of issues issues of torture, as well as historically very low conviction rates of the reported crimes, in particular torture. The latest annual report, for instance, of IPID indicates an increase in reports of torture from 2021 until 2022, almost 20%. So going up from around 200 to 230 cases. This is in addition to reports against the police of assault, corruption, rape. And again, this begs the question is, where do you draw the line between acts of violence or war and torture and rape, and in terms of the degradation experienced by the victims. And again, just from that same report, that of those 228 torture cases against the police, only 94 were addressed in the year, so some of them still in process. 34 were declined to be prosecuted due to lack of evidence. One was acquitted. One was noted as undetected, which means insufficient evidence. And only 6 were referred for prosecution. And that in turn kind of relates to how criminal prosecution rates in the world in general are quite low, but in South Africa in particular. And how lower charges against the charges against police are even less likely to be prosecuted. Say again. Oh, sorry, I thought somebody was saying something. And again, that there were lower prosecution rates against police, and in particular for cases of torture, which are almost non-existent, in part due to the fact that it's relatively new legislation and that this monitoring mechanism is in place. In terms of international mechanisms, in 2023, South Africa had its first visits from the UN subcommittee on monitoring particularly the use of treatment and torture in incarceration, and they noted that South Africa is yet to fully establish the correct mechanisms to be fully in compliance with the protocol in terms of ill treatment, particularly in detention. And in fact, the Human Rights Commission is today also holding a seminar where it's reporting on how to improve these mechanisms, both locally and internationally. And then the independent assessment preventative mechanism noted the need for more regular reporting, a lack of qualitative and disaggregated data. So saying what kinds of perpetration related to which areas and how they were prosecuted, and little to no information regarding immigration detention centers. And there's also an ongoing need for psychological support and reparation of victims of violence and torture. Learning from the TRC to counter the reduction in budgets on these programs that we've noted in the last couple of years. So reparation being an important means to deal with both evaluating the history of torture, but also how does one redress those victims. We then, just to close off with the contradictory nature of our foreign policy, as you will be aware, President Ramaphosa met with General Mohammed Dagalo, who's the Sudanese kind of coup president, and one of the perpetrators behind one of Africa's most grotesque war crimes, with about 600,000 people believed to have died under torturous and significant human rights violations. And then a week later, government took Israel to the International Court of allegations of genocide. So it's South Africa's policy to Israel has been marked by support for this Palestinian rights and criticism of Israel's policies, whereas in contrast, it's taken a non-alignment approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As this kind of in part ties with its alignment in the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance, where South Africa has in turn also characterized economic cooperation and support for the One China policy, and has been silent both locally and internationally on the PRC systematic human rights abuses, which Ngodup will mention later. As we and as well as us foregoing our constitutional right to religious freedom by succumbing to Chinese pressure and refusing the Dalai Lama entry into the country on 2 occasions already. The differing approaches to these international issues reflect the lack of coherency in international policy and selective memory for the international support that South Africa required to overcome its human rights and political rights violations during the apartheid regime. And hopefully there will be some increased space with a more coalition government now to introduce more coherency in our international policy as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adam, for that interesting presentation. When there will be time for Q&A, I guess we will all have questions to ask for more further enlightening. Without further ado, colleagues, let me invite our friend Mr. Ngodup to give us his presentation.
Okay, Atta. Good evening, all the speakers and attendees. Thank you for joining us. This webinar, very important webinar on the International Day of Support for the Victims of Torture. So I would like to first dedicate this talk to all the torture victims that is taking place all over the world, be that in Africa, in the Middle East, in Russia, China, but I will be really focusing a little bit the torture and the human rights repression in occupied Tibet, because I wouldn't be able to do give justice to all the tortures victims that is taking place all over the world. Okay. So today's topic we all know is to highlight the political repression and torture faced by the Tibetan political activists, freedom fighters, and human rights defenders in the China, and within the context of the observance of International Day for support for torture victims. Okay, next slide. So before really going into the subject, I would like to, because to bring that connection, the brief history of the Chinese occupation in Tibet. In 1950, the Chinese armed forces marched into Tibet, and that was the beginning of the annexation, occupation of Tibet. And in 1951, and the infamous 17-point agreement was forced upon the Tibetan delegation in Beijing, which sort of acknowledges the sovereignty of People's Republic over Tibet. And there was a little bit of coexistence from 1951 till 1959. His Holiness Dalai Lama tried his best to coexist with the Chinese, but it was impossible because of, and the Chinese also didn't keep up with the promises within the article of the 17-point agreement. So this whole frustration of the Tibet people culminated in 1959 with the national uprising at Lhasa. And this was violently suppressed with the weapons, and His Holiness escaped, into India, and all this history we all know. Next. So today the Tibet is governed by the Chinese Communist Party directly from Beijing. Of course, it has given a sort of a name, autonomous region, which of course doesn't really cover the whole Tibet region. But within even the Tibet autonomy region, which is supposed to have a little bit of autonomous, but that is really, to say the least, a joke, because everything, the most powerful person which govern the autonomous region or province in any of the Chinese region is the Chinese Communist Party, which holds the most executive. He's the head of the party of the region. He's the executive. He's the military head. So he is sort of nobody can do anything because he has so much power. So that has been since 1959, that person or the Communist Party in Tibet, Tibet region has been the Chinese. And yeah, so next is so as a result of this Chinese occupation, we have recorded from 1950 till now, 1.2 million Tibetans have died under different circumstances. Of course, many of them died while fighting with the Chinese People's Liberation Army, many during the Cultural Revolution. So that is the recorded that we have. And before the rally 1979, which after the death of Mao Zedong, and the Chinese under the President Deng Xiaoping, who started sort of opening up the China economic liberalization. From 1950 till 1979, you can say during the 1579, I think about 6,000 Tibetan monastic learning centers. I mean, we are not counting the hermitage, retreat centers, and so the big monasteries. about 6,000 has been sort of destroyed. I mean, that is recorded, by the. And recently, I mean, from 1990 till now, 154 Tibetans have sort of committed self-immolation to highlight the human rights, lack of freedom in Tibet, and the economic discrimination, culture sinicization, and also in the Chinese policy in Tibet as a whole, due to the frustration. So 154 Tibetans have committed, and many of them have died. Some of them survived the self-immolation, but I think it's a very tragic thing. So all this, I mean, that itself, 154 Tibetans have committed. They're all Tibet from all walks of life, and most of them have actually born after the Cultural Revolution under the Chinese rule. So that speaks a lot that there is such sort of a stifling lack of freedom in Tibet. Okay, so there is a huge human rights abuses violation in Tibet under the Chinese occupation. I do not need to mention it. Other next slide. So the practice of torture by the CCP against the Tibetan political freedom fighter, I think is well documented. And so there is sort of a physical torture, I mean, which includes beatings and electric shocks, and I can't see that. Okay. And psychological torture and degrading treatment of prisoner, experience inhuman conditions, and then pretrial torture. This is very important to extract confessions in the detention. Recently, I met one Tibetan who escaped from Tibet during the pandemic, 2022. And he was well educated, and he worked in the Chinese bank. And so he was able to escape, and he had to escape because he shared some information to the Radio Free Asia in India. So he knew that he was the Chinese police and Secret Service were after him. So he escaped, and he said that once he was detained in one of the Shikatse detention center, and so for 3 days he was tied up into a chair, and he was beaten, and he was never allowed to go even to the toilet, So, I mean, what he described was sort of unbelievable. All his, you can say, the poo and urines, he had to just do it on his, in his trouser. And there was a lot of flies, because 3 days he could not, so there was dirty, there was smell. So this sort of, I mean, that is better, I mean, he's at least educated so others, So, so that is the sort of a torture that Chinese inflict on the Tibetans. And another type of beating by the authorities is very common. And police is a sort of a, this is in the system. And collective punishment. So what it means, I think those village who from there, if suppose one of the self-immolation, if the whole village has been put into sort of a punished, for sort of supporting, or not even supporting, because he was that a person was from that village who has self-immolated. So the whole village was sort of punished for not giving. And what sort of punishment? They will be denied job. They will be giving a lot of other problems. So the systematic torture, the torture practice are not isolated incident, but part of the systemic approach by the law enforcement and official in Tibet aimed at breaking the wheels and the resistance of the Tibetans. So that is the whole purpose. Okay, next. So I'm not just talking, I mean, out of cloud or blue. So this whole case of the torture is well documented by the different human rights organization, and the CTA has got well documentation. Then the Free Tibet, then the International Campaign for Tibet, and the United Nations periodic human rights. They have also documented all these cases. So the list is there. Okay, next. So, with this, the impunity and lack of justice. So the international, I mean, as the Maggie has already said, has told that the United Nations has passed the convention, International Convention on the Civil and Political Rights to prohibit the torture. And the Chinese government is signatory to this. And in support of that, the International Day for in support of the torture victim is also passed to make this convention, to implement this convention more clearly, and is binding on all the states, all the member states, whether they are signatory to that convention or not. However, the Chinese government, they will sign all convention, freedom, everything, but in reality, they don't practice what they sign up to. So same thing, I mean, they have signed, but the tortures is not only Tibetan, but also the Uyghurs, and within even in China also, those who fight for human rights within the China and southern Mongolia. The Uyghur case is very, very pertinent, and the Tibet case. So this is is a big issue, and the Chinese government will not. And those officers who inflict, who perpetrate this kind of torture, are not afraid of getting punished, because the Chinese support, the government is in support of such sort of a system. Okay, other next. So what is the whole thing? So with this webinar, sort of a conversation, we need to, the participant and everybody, the whole world, we need to call upon the different human rights organization and the Tibet support group all over the Tibet specifically, and other countries, to support this sort of a call for the end to the torture and the justice for the victim. This is very important. Without any justice, I think there will be no peace. And everybody, South Africa is very, the experience of South Africa is very well known to the Reconciliation Committee. But luckily, I think, because at least there was a little bit of closure. I mean, not fully, everybody was not fully satisfied, but the to the Reconciliation committee was adopted, and they sort of people to a very large extent, I think it did a very good job. And still there is, because of that, there is a huge, there is a peace in South Africa, not satisfactory to everybody, but I think I would say that much better than many of the other countries. Okay, the next. So at the end, I would like to say that it is so important to raise the global awareness and solidarity in fight against the torture and repression in Tibet, and the importance of media sharing, putting this information and raising the awareness so that human rights issue, not only in Tibet, but wherever it's taking place, is highlighted in each country, wherever is, so that there need to be advocacy to be built all over the places where the human rights violation and tortures are being done. So next, Ada. So with this, it is my sort of my request, and the request from this webinar, the conversation that we all the entity, we need to support the organization that is working to end torture and human rights violation in Tibet through activism, through whatever the means we can do. If they can materially support, well and good. If they can give their skill, well and good. And that applies not only to Tibet, but the other places where torture is being taking place. And it is important to engage wherever it is possible, wherever there is a space to negotiate with your national government to encourage the other countries to end torture and human rights violation wherever it's taking place. Of course, South Africa, they are very, very active in supporting the Gaza. Well and good, that's well and good, but they should also do the same thing to other countries. Even, I mean, Mr. Adam has said, I mean, in Africa and even in China also, you cannot hide that. You cannot have a double standard. So it's very good they are supporting Gaza, very holding out. Even they went to the International Criminal Court. But they should also, because I mean, they should also do it for Tibet and other places also. And it's important to educational outreach, educate the public. Public diplomacy is the most important. So wherever there is sort of an opportunity, this is one of the place, such thing, go to the university, anywhere where there is sort of meeting possible. So try to educate the public on the situation in Tibet and in other sort of area like Xinjiang, East Turkestan, and other community who are suffering huge human rights abuses and torture. They should also educate and campaign for them. So with this, I think I have shared a little bit of what I know, prepared for about this. But let me once again thank everybody for joining this. And the torture and the political repression, human rights repression in Tibet is not a few days or 1 or 2 decades, story, but it has been going on since 1950, when the China started Chinese occupation of Tibet. And since 1959, all of the Tibet has been under the tight control of the Chinese government. And so they pursued the democratic reform. Under that, I mean, so much people have died, so many people have died. And under the frenzy of the cultural relation, much more even destruction of the culture heritage, monastic, and many people seen. I mean, those people have died. It's well documented. It happened not only in Tibet, but it also happened in China also. So we must remember all those people who have really died under such circumstances. And I always pray and remember there's a great sacrifice for Tibet and other community who have also sacrificed their life for the betterment of their own community. So with this, I would like to close my talk. Thank you, Ada.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ngodup La, for such brilliant presentations and the case studies that are just in point. Colleagues, before I open up for Q&A or comment, let me just ask our speakers if each of them could attend to a question that I would like to ask. For the first speaker, Magdalene, you talked about the UN. You mentioned something in passing that the UN is weak in dealing with aggressors and perpetrators of torture. And the question that I would like to ask you is, why do you think the UN is weak in dealing with aggressors and perpetrators of torture? And also, if while you are answering, if you may reflect on there is something also that you mentioned regarding UN acknowledging torture. If you could just throw a bit of light on what you were intending to say. And for Mr. Adam, the question I want to ask you in response to what you have presented is that you had mentioned, or you mentioned that there is low rate of conviction of perpetrators of torture. I guess that is across the globe. And the question I want you to answer is, why do you think there is low rate of conviction of perpetrators of torture? And of course, Mr. Ngodup La, you talked about the persistent culture of impunity. And my question to you as well will be, why do you think there is a persistence of culture of impunity in terms of the issues of human rights that we have been discussing? And then colleagues, if you have a question, a comment, there is an icon on your screen that you may just indicate by show of hand, and then we will bring you in to ask your questions or your comment. We don't have so much time. If our speakers could just use 2 minutes each to answer the question I have posed them. Thank you. I'm going to start from Mr. Adam while I move to Magdalene and then to Ngodup.
Thank you. Are you asking for me to reply now before further questions?
Yes,
come?
please.
Well, yeah, so the difficulty really is that how do you distinguish the torture as kind of persistent, degrading, and consistent human rights violation versus conventional assault, rape, solitary confinement, and these kind of methods of sometimes of extracting information. So sometimes I feel like oh, sorry, let's see, can you hear me? Oh, okay, so I was just receiving a call from Elizabeth. Anyway, so the distinguishing of the torture as distinct from other forms of crime is difficult, and already the prosecution rates are quite low in South Africa. So for a relatively new crime or understanding of torture, it seems to me that it's related to the the nature of that crime as overlapping with other forms of crime, which themselves are not being prosecuted. But I think in particular also the international definition of torture has the element in which it's perpetrated by the state. So there's perhaps a perceived conflict of interest between the state as the perpetrator and the arbitrator or convictor of these crimes. So although you have independent investigative mechanisms that investigate the police, then they are also colleagues of these police who are being perpetrated. So okay, sorry, I'm gonna move.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adam Maggie. Magdalene.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atta. The first question that you asked was in relation to why is the United Nations weak? Why do I say that the United Nations is weak? I did not say that they are weak. I said they lack common sense, which by default means their weakness doesn't apply to the fact that they cannot uphold their own conventions, their own protocols, and what must happen in terms of what is a basic human right? What is the value of a life? And I think that the presentation that was made by Adam was one that was very reflective on how the TRC issues of torture in South Africa, etc., are swept under the carpet. It is not that we are now in a democracy that we don't have issues of police brutality, for that matter. We don't have situations where those who are looking for asylum in this country and refugee status in this country are being, under very severe conditions. So for me, I believe that one, it's the instruments and the language of the drafters of both resolutions, conventions, etc., that are very cautious. And that's why I said the manner in which the special rapporteur comes back after observing detention camps, etc., and says, no, what's needed is medical treatment. But what is needed is actually justice. And I think that is the core cutting edge. That is the core point at which I find to be the mannerism, the mechanisms that the United Nations approaches is very manipulating in its language, making one, it's not decisive. There's no decisiveness in the manner in which the United Nations applies its resolutions. Even its resolutions are created with a loophole for further a special envoy, a special rapporteur, etc., to go in and investigate. Now, if you are given a report and you can see that, okay, these many people are in prison, this is what's going on. There it is in the media, outwardly in the media. Well, with the Tibet situation, it's difficult because of the Chinese not wanting to be using external forms of media. But it is clear as day. And we are then subjected subjected to be in a position where we are forced to comply with a resolution, comply with a sovereign plan, etc., of that nature, in the anticipation. And it is, we know of wars that are going on for decades, for hundreds of years. And in those small pockets, the United Nations, in my view, has a role in depopularization of the planet, because its focus is no longer the kind of focus one would want to expect, as you would expect with the climate. So for me, it's a massive issue of, okay, we need to get rid of X, Y, and Z, or we need to eliminate this because it's a problem that we can't keep facing. I mean, you know, the special committee of decolonization sits in the United Nations in October. And there are, even though there are resolutions, there's no implementation of those resolutions. So this is why I say, and I'm speaking from experience, sitting in the UN over years, debating various issues. It's just a talk shop. You just listen, you look at how many people you have, how many people you don't, and that's how it moves on. The second question is acknowledging cultural aspects. And I think that is one of the things that is a problem. It's a lack of tolerance. It's a lack of tolerance that is growing globally against various groups of people, whether they are, whether it's patriarchy, which is a lack of tolerance towards women, whether it is war, which is then an egotistical issue, whether it is, I believe that my faith is diminishing and hence I must now close down teaching monasteries, or I must then subject a person's right to freedom of expression, thought, and speech to what I want them to be. And this is where I think, 1884 was one of the critical turning points where we saw the sharing over maybe a couple of drinks over the sharing of the continent according to cultural determination, which has caused strife in the continent, in Africa, for example. And that strife has not been attended to, which is why Adam speaks about the 600,000 killings that have taken place, because of lack of tolerance and not acknowledging cultural determination. And I think that that is where I'm saying that the intolerance of cultural determination has been one of the breeding grounds of occupation, of war, and of what we are discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalene, for that. Ngodup, please.
Okay. Okay, Atta, thank you for your very pertinent question. Why there is such sort of a systematic impunity and lack of justice in the Chinese existing governance system? And I also have been reflecting on this, why the Chinese government is being sort of very open in signing different protocols and conventions of the United Nations, especially the human rights, and so on and so forth. Even the civil rights, the prevention of the torture. I think they have signed it. So, but in reality, the practice, why there is such sort of they are not practicing what they are supposed to, So even in their own constitution, there is a very, very lofty thing, If you look at it, it's a very good, sort of thing. So I think this, the whole sort of this culture of showing something is because it's developed from their own culture, because Chinese, they're very particular of saving their face in individual, So anything they which sort of degrades or they doesn't look nice in front of the public, they are very particular, very particular. So even the Tibet, we have already experienced that, when before the after 1989, Tibetan started internationalizing the Tibet issue, went all over the world, So the Chinese were so angry, because they are losing their face. The Tibetans were attacking their embassy. They were sort of doing demonstration when the Chinese leader visit Europe, America, or India. So they are mad about that because they lose their face. So this whole the facade of trying to be in align with the international route and regulation. They're sort of signing all the protocols and other convention is, I think, stems from that. But in the reality is what anybody who challenges their power, the Communist Party power, they will crush it. They will not see anything. They will crush them. Look at 1989 Tiananmen Square. In front of the wall, 10,000 of their own students were killed. And what is taking place in Uzbekistan? And what has been taking place in Tibet for so long? So this, I think, in my sort of experience and a little bit of reading why China is doing this, because the whole power structure is a totalitarian structure, and Communist Party, they think and they have the right to rule over the whole China, and anybody, any group, even the Falun Gong, we know it, the sort of one group. So they also crush them. So any group which is any individual, very rich individual like Jack Ma, today is nothing. Is no more. I mean, they have confiscated his company. So any big businessman, wealthy people, the Chinese they will cut into size.
Thank you so much.
Even I think this is the red line is anybody who challenges or seems to be challenging the Communist Party's power, they will be crushed. And for that, all the convention, all the nice letters and constitutions are nothing. They will do it. They will just walk over it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ngodup.
Okay.
Colleagues, we are above time. Let me just invite Elizabeth to give us a closing remark. Thank you. Elizabeth, are you there?
Yes, there was a small glitch in the electricity, so it cut me off for a little while. But welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for the presentations, Magdalene, Ngodup, lovely seeing you again, and also Adam. Thank you very much for your informative presentations, and also Tibettv for making it happen. Dr. Atala, you are a true friend and supporter of the Tibetan cause, and you have engaged some very important initiatives over the years. And for these, your friendship is very special and appreciated. Thank you so very much. Now, I've just made a couple of notes. This is a huge issue, isn't it? And it's a really important subject that needs to be addressed. From my side, but as long as people's egos are increased with their greed for power and money, it's going to be a difficult road to travel. Magdalene, what you're asking, who is accountable and who will enforce accountability? That's an important question. And maybe you have some practical ideas so that they can be pressed forward. Just practical ideas that, the likes of us can implement in some, small way, which will make a difference. And Adam, unfortunately, double standards pervade worldwide. You mentioned psychological support, which I think is so important these days. It's really very, very sad what's happening in the world. From the Tibet side, Tibet is such a prime example of how China uses seduction and barbaric ways to expand their power. And unfortunately, everybody's just ignoring this. And it's very, very sad indeed. But in conclusion, Tibet continues to be an example of how these worldwide problems should be handled, especially psychologically. And it is mainly through the insight and advice of our seniors who have greater insight than the majority of humanity. And, as we sit here, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is in America, I don't know when he's undergoing his knee operation, but, you know, our thoughts and prayers go out to him, and may his aspirations be fulfilled. And let us hope and pray that this will happen in our lifetime. But thank you very much, everybody. It's been a very informative, and let's see what can be done. It would be nice if all the speakers could submit some, you know, Ngodup, you gave some really good examples of how we can move forward, but it would be nice to sort of have those, you know, documented and perhaps sent out to different Tibet support groups as well. But thank you so very much, everybody. It's been lovely seeing you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. Thank you also for your kind
Thank you.
words.